And we're live. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Homo Ludens, the channel on history and board games. For this Saturday live show, we're trying a new format, the Wargame Bookclub. The principle is pretty simple. Every 4 to 6 weeks, the community votes for a book. Then I invite a panel to talk about it, and all of us have a few weeks to read it. The first book that was chosen by the viewers was Simulating War by Philip Sabin. I defined ahead of time a list of topics that I would like us to address with the panel when talking about this book, but this is more a basis for conversation rather than a strict structure. So if you're looking the video after the live stream, I'll add some time codes in the description so that you can navigate topic by topic. But let's start by a brief overview of today's book. Today's book is this one. So Phil Sabin's Simulating War. You can see I have a few things. It's a bit of a mess. Mark pages. Just for context, Phil Sabin is a professor of strategic studies at the King's College in London. King's College is actually pretty serious when it comes to war games, as they currently have a research group dedicated to that topic called the Wargaming Network. The book Simulating War was originally released in 2012, has been repeated multiple times, and is considered a classic in wargaming studies. And it's structured around 3 parts: theory, where Phil discusses the basics of wargaming, mechanics, and this is the author going through the toolboxes when it comes to conflict simulation. And then he has a third party, which are examples where he details his personal experience as a teacher and a designer. And to talk about this book today, I have a few guests. And first, then I'm going to bring them on the screen. And I have Natalia. Hi, Natalia. David. Hey, David. Cory Graham and Riccardo. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining tonight. Very happy to have you with me for that first Wargame Book Club, which is, as I was telling you a bit in introduction, something I'm a bit... I don't know what to expect, to be honest. So having you with me, I feel better. I feel I assembled a really good panel. I have a strong group, and I can totally rely on them. So setting the expectation, I don't exactly know what I'm doing, but I believe that you will. So that's the whole approach that I'm taking to that whole thing. But I think before going through talking about the books, I think it would be awesome maybe to have each of you presenting yourself briefly. Riccardo, presenting yourself briefly. So, and
okay,
we'll start with...
I am the Italian here, so I have to speak less, but okay.
And we'll start with you, Natalia, if that's okay.
Good evening, welcome everybody. My name is Natalia Wojtowicz. I have been designing Wargame within NATO Civil Military Cooperation Center of Excellence for 5 years. After that, I moved to the Hague University of Applied Sciences, where I again design games now on international security, but also industrial safety. And I am working on my first game to be published. That's a nice teaser to end the introduction.
Nice, cool. Thanks, Natalia. And as Riccardo and I were discussing before you joined, it looks like Natalia is the only person who's actually serious about this. So it's nice that we have an actual professional joining us to talk about the serious stuff. So thanks for joining, David.
I was thinking the exact same thing when I saw the people, and I was like, "Oh, we've got one serious person and a bunch of people that just pretend."
It's not the same.
Yeah. So David Thompson designed not serious war games.
Nope.
So and mostly lighter weight, right? That have some Euro game influences.
Riccardo.
Okay, here I am. My name is Riccardo Masini, and some of you may know me from my brief interactions with Dan Pancaldi in his channel. I have a YouTube channel, blog, which is mostly Italian. I write about books, about games, about books about games, articles. I have a podcast. I play games. Sometimes I even have a live here and now. And I am a wargamer since I was, I think, 7 or 8. It's all my father's fault. So that's it. Here I am.
And actually, there is a series of you interviewing your own father on your channel. So yeah, for those who are interested, go to Riccardo's channel. Really great stuff. You might need to know some Italian for some of the videos, but I expect that everyone speaks Italian fluently, so that's fine. Cory?
Hi, my name is Cory Graham. I am one of the co-designers of Vijayanagara, new game on GMT's P500 list. And I've been playing Wargames since I was 12.
And you started with ASL.
I started with ASL.
Yes, a true grognard. We have one actual wargame professional and we have one actual grognard. So we have a good panel. We have actually a pretty solid panel. I'm pretty happy with that. And Cory, if I'm not mistaken, Vijayanagara reached 500 a few weeks ago, right?
Yep, we passed the barrier. So
congratulations. That's awesome. That's really cool.
Great.
But first of all, I would like to say to everyone in the chat, thanks for joining. As I was saying earlier, I would like this session to be as interactive as possible. So please feel free to put some question, add some comment. I would put them on screen, so that would be actually awesome to have that interaction with you guys. Except you, Scott Moore, because you haven't read the book. So I have an eye on you. You're not allowed to ask any question. You need to read the book. That's not okay. No, that's actually fine. And we have actually a first question before jumping in from Marco that is actually asking Natalia, which NATO Center of Excellence did you work for?
That was the Civil Military Cooperation Center, CIMIC Center. So for military, that is J9.
Nice. So I hope that answers your question, Marco. Thanks, everyone. But I guess we can probably start jumping into it. So the first question that I had, and that I actually teased you a bit just before we started this live stream, is that, as I said, this book is a reference, and I guess that you didn't discover the book when I reached out to invite you to this live stream. You probably already knew the book and potentially even read it before. And my question for you to start is, when did you learn about that book? Have you read it before? What impression did it left you? And did revisiting it before that live stream, you realize things that in the meantime between now and then actually changing your perception of wargaming? And maybe we can start with you, Natalia.
Yes, I shared that before we started. That was for me an interesting book 2 times, because I read it before I designed my first war game, and I read it 5 years later when I was about 20 games into designing. So I was looking through different basic things, and some of them stayed the same. Nothing changed within the 5 years. Some of them changed for me. So that was a good moment to come back and reflect on different aspects, definitely.
And you, David, did you?
I was familiar with the book, but I had not read it. So
Okay.
One dark secret for me is I don't do a lot of academic reading. So most of the reading I do is historical, and you can always tell like the next 2 or 3 games I'm designing because of what I'm currently reading, right? Historical literature. So, yeah.
Great. Riccardo, I guess you've read it before, right?
Yeah, I read it before, but it is strange because from the main things I am also a member of the Italian Military History Society, so I also write military history books. And when I write military history books, I read books about wargaming, and when I'm writing books about war games, I read books about military history. One thing I realized in all these when I reread this book is how much this book is essential even for historical research. Even in my historical research, I found out that as its approach, its critical approach, really is really useful even outside the wargaming world. So in this last rereading of this book, I applied all my previous experiences, and I found out the pieces that got stuck in my head a bit unknowingly, and then came back later in my method of research. So this is one of the great virtues of this book.
And you, Cory?
So I had heard about it a couple years ago, but I've never read it before. Read it over the last week or so. Really interesting for me. When I had heard about it, I probably would have disagreed with a lot of the things I read in it. I would have been much more on the train of like super complex, super in-depth concepts, more detail, more data, more everything. I've completely done a 180 on that in the last 2 years. I'm much more in the micro game side of things now. So it was really interesting reading it, kind of thinking of how it was when I originally heard about it and how I am now.
Great, but thanks for. Maybe I should say what I. Yeah. So for me, I also read it quite a while ago when I started getting interested also in wargaming. I found it originally very inspiring, because I never really considered wargaming, and I think it really opened my mind to what it could bring, especially when it comes to interacting with history overall. So I thought it was great, but rereading it to prepare that live stream, I realized that I disagreed with a lot of some of not a lot, but with some key assumptions that Phil Sabin is making. I think it's due to when he was writing his book originally. So that's potentially something we'll discuss. But I realized that even though I still find it extremely insightful, and I was really happy that I read it, and I think it's a classic, I realized a few years in that actually I had, in the experience of designing games, I actually had my perspective changing a bit. And I think maybe we can start by talking about this. By maybe discussing one first thing before I think there is a series of topics that I want to address, and I think the first topic that I want to address is how did you receive, or I don't know, interpret Phil Sabin's description of what is a war game. Personally, I was quite surprised about how biased it was toward specifically military simulation. And I felt like it was a bit restrictive. So coming back to what I was saying about, I think I evolved also along the years when I thought, well, that's a pretty limited vision of what a war game is. But I was wondering what were you when you were reading the book? What did you think about this original assumption of what is a war game? And maybe for this time I will start the other way around and ask you, Cory, to maybe go first.
All right, so this is one of the parts of the book I disagree with him on. I do find his description, his definition of it to be incredibly narrow. A conflict simulation, right? More than a war game, right? A conflict simulation covers a wide variety of things. It does not just, units on a battlefield fighting each other. It's anything from political combat, economic combat, like any sort of like actual conflict that you are having. So I mean, I disagreed with that pretty strongly.
And you, Riccardo? You're muted.
Unmute. I was too brief. Okay. Not to defend Sabin, but it's true that sometimes his vision is limited. But it is because this book has been written in 2012, so a lot of games, so later games that broadened the definition of war games had not already come out. There were many, but they were not trends. Today, it's a trend to broaden the definition of war game. In 2012, it was not. Probably this is a consequence of Sabin's academic approach, academic origin, because he first tries to narrow down an aspect, a factor, and then lets us broaden it. He is making a speech. He's making an exposition. He's exposing some concepts. He needs to fixate some content. He needs to simplify. Then it's up to us to broaden that simplification. That said, I think that the problems of this book are not in part one, we will speak about later, are not in part one, but in part two. Because probably this is even more evident after. Because with a general concept, we can broaden it. But when he speaks about techniques, we cannot broaden anything. Okay.
And that's the thing.
But his definition of war games is not bad. We must take it with a grain of salt and contextualize it in the historical moment when it was written.
I think I don't fully agree with you, Riccardo, on this. And I think the mechanics part is actually a great proof of that. But we'll talk about it then, because I think we'll go back to this. And I think there is a good argument that is made in the mechanics section around the fact that it was actually already broader and he was already missing a bit of the points. But what did you think, David?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I mean, I definitely agree with Cory that I think that the definition that Sabin provides for us is way too constrained. Now, having said that, it's at the very beginning of the book. He presents it, and the important thing is that he's presenting his definition that frames the rest of the book. Right. And so it kind of doesn't really, I would submit it doesn't really matter the definition of a wargame is subjective. He's presented us with his subjective opinion, and he's provided us the framework for which we're going to receive the rest of the book. So even though I disagree with it, it at least frames the rest of the reading.
Yeah, no, and that's a fair point. And for you, Natalia, what was your reaction to that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree with both points, because for me the definition is much broader, but that might be because I've been always pushing the borders. So it is hard for me to subscribe to that one limited vision. And I had a big discussion recently whether when you come to a military exercise and you involve real personnel, then it is not a war game, because it can still be done as a war game. So there are a lot of indeed friction points there that I think I have seen pushed before. And this is where I would say it is a good definition to start with for his concept, but reality extends beyond it.
I think that's a really good point. And then even beyond his description, so I know I've been critical about the description that he has. I think there is something on which I agreed with him then, and I even more agree with him now, and that's the values of wargamings when it comes to seeing it as a heuristic tool to approach history. And I think what he's saying that is I find very interesting, and that's also something that I would like to have your impressions on, is he's basically saying that as a player, it's a great way to interact with history. It's like a paper time machine, and I think this image is very powerful, and it's because it puts you in the position of one of those actors. But I think he's making an even stronger point about the benefits of designing a game, which I think is very interesting. About actually having to design a game about a specific topic gives you a framework for research, even if you are not an academic. And it makes it very accessible because you actually have an objective, a goal, and forcing yourself to approach it and modelize something. And I think that was a very compelling point that I thought was very, I don't know, for me, it still resonates a lot, that I find really brilliant. And I was really thinking about some of the initiatives that we've been working on and different things that I see happening, like the Zenobia Awards or the Concept Game Jam that we pushing people to actually embrace game design and use it as a way to approach history in different ways. I thought that was very modern. So on that front, just to different Phil, I thought that's still awesome. Really, really cool. I don't know what you guys thought about that specific part around it being a heuristic tool for historical design, for historical research or discovery.
Yeah, if I can speak up on that. I mean, I absolutely agree, both in terms of as a player, but especially as a game designer. The act of deconstructing the whatever it is that the game is about, right, down to its component parts to build a model, it forces you to look at the entire thing critically, and beyond just telling a narrative, right? So we have to be able to actually model the event, pull out all of the different component elements. Now, I think one thing, and we may talk about this more later on, that I think is extremely important is I would submit that Sabin largely views these simulations as a simulation of like a combat, right? At whatever scale, but it's a simulation of combat. And I don't really subscribe to that. I think it's more important to say it's a model of whatever it is you're trying to educate the player on or evoke, right? And so I might design a board game or a war game around trying to tell a story, and my goal is with that model is to tell that narrative, not to recreate a simulation. But that aside, the act of going through and deconstructing it and building the model is an absolute fantastic method, right, for educating the designer.
If I can add to that, I think that probably another problem is that for Sabin, wargame and simulation are synonyms, which for me it's not true. Because there may be a wargame that is not a simulation. Risk is a wargame. We must accept that. It is not a simulation by no way, but it is a wargame because it is a game about war. So in doing so, because he accepts a narrow concept of war games, he must accept simulation as a synonym of wargames. He is somewhat forced. And in this, you're right, Fred. This is evident in his second part when he must stress out typically simulationist mechanics. However, one thing that Sabin, especially when he speaks about historical research, really stresses out and really is very important, is that wargames are not about events. Wargames and simulations are about dynamics. That is what moves events. Because a CRT describes a retreat, an advance, an exchange, an elimination, but these are just material facts. I take out a counter, I flip it to a reducer side. This is not interesting. What is interesting is the CRT itself, not its effects. The composition of the CRT, the modifiers, the terrain effects, and all of these are dynamics. And when we have these very solid knowledge of this, we can expand it and go to political military simulations, hybrid simulations, and apply the same mechanics. And we can focus on dynamics. And this is exactly what a good historical researcher must do. He must start from the facts, but then go on and try to describe dynamics, which are the really important parts of the research, at least for me.
And maybe for the viewers, if among the viewers there are people who are not very familiar with wargaming, I'm just going to explain the term CRT. So CRT stands for Combat Result Table, and that's a tool that you often see in wargaming that tells you for that combat you roll a die, and this is the effect of that combat. So it is something that you see a lot in classical hex and counter game, where you have a force ratio, you roll a die, and depending on the force ratio and the value you roll, you have different effects that are happening. Just for the benefit of people who wouldn't necessarily know what a CRT is. And I think both of you are actually providing a good transition to the second question that I want to have, because you're talking about the fact that he's making a synonym between simulation and war games, and I think that transition well into the second topic that I wanted to discuss, which is the whole point that Phil is making around accuracy versus simplicity, and this idea that he has that the more you want simulation value, the more you'll have to increase complexity. And basically, you're trying to make a bit of a trade-off between those two things that are on both sides of a spectrum. I have strong views about that, but first I would like to know what Natalia thought about this specifically.
So what I always try to do, and I say that also to my students now, is constructive complexity. And that means there is a reason for so many elements to be included, or for so many difficult mechanics to employ. And that simply means if I am looking at a very complex system, then I have to show it in a complex way. Otherwise, I would be missing parts of it. And the same for simplicity. If I can go through a quicker road, then I should take it. And I try to always take the shortest road to the merit, so the mechanics for themselves are not bigger than the point of the game. And that is my main answer, to try to balance it out for its meaning.
I think the idea of constructive complexity is a very interesting one, and I think I really like the term, so I think I might borrow it, Natalia, and sound smart, but it's all from you, so you will know. But I think that I think Cory, it would be interesting also to have your point of view, because the game that you've been co-designing, Vijayanagara, is also taking the coin series in a direction that is actually more approachable and reducing some of the complexity. So I'm thinking you might have also an interesting point of view on that part around like accuracy versus complexity, or
so I think that when you're designing a game, especially for the mass market, right? So Sabin's designing games for the classroom. That's a big reason why they're so simple. You have 2 hours to teach the game, run through the game, maybe run through the game a second time, maybe. And you're generally running through a bunch of people playing a game that's really a two-player game at the same time. So when you're designing a game for the mass market, I think you have a complexity budget that you're shooting for, right? You want a medium complexity game, you want a more complex game, you want a simple game. Your subject matter is really going to tell you where that's going to lie. Some subjects are simple, some are very much not, right? Modern day Afghanistan, not simple. Really, Afghanistan at any time period, not simple. India is not super simple, but the period we chose is a little bit more straightforward than a lot of Indian history is, right? So we were able to take something like the coin system, simplify some things out, model how these kingdoms are interacting, and then make a relatively simple and approachable game, and be able to spend our complexity budget in things that model stuff that's happening better in the history. Things like combat resolution, cultural integration, things like that. And I think that's really important. You need to choose what your thesis of a game is, and you need to choose what you're willing to spend your complexity on.
I like also this idea of complexity budget, like you're setting yourself an amount of complexity you want to have, and then you decide to spend on where it matters. But actually, personally, I have a core issue with even the fact that the two are correlated, accuracy and simplicity. But I think I will put David on, because I think that's probably what David wants to talk about, because he really wanted that question to be brought up. And I think that both him and we actually agree on that point. So David, go ahead.
This more so than any other part of the book hurts my soul, my brain, every part of my essence, because it's like you've presented us with this false dichotomy.
Yeah.
Like it cannot, they're not even on the same spectrum. They're nothing, right? Like to be things on a spectrum, they have to be opposites. And like we have these two things that are there's not even necessarily a relation between the two things. So, what I would like to have seen is an argument made that somehow complexity necessarily leads to accuracy. But there's not even an argument made to justify that claim. So, I read that and I just thought, okay, as I got into that chapter and I started with, I was like, well, let's see how much of the book hinges on this. And he keeps coming back to this topic of sort of, so you sort of accept the fact that we should just assume that complexity necessarily leads to accuracy. And it's just not the case, right? And so I just sort of fundamentally disagree with that entire premise.
And I think there is a lot of counterexample to that, of overly complex games that are really poorly accurate. And you're really thinking, is the two really correlated? Can't you come up with something very complex that actually doesn't depict anything that makes sense? And I don't think it's the point that he's making, that the more complex it is, the more accurate it will be, because he actually says something really interesting about computer war games and the bottom-up approach of having everything quantified and having it super detailed, and then having this bottom-up that it will generalize and say something interesting about the topic. And he actually is against that. And I'm thinking it's weird because he makes that false dichotomy, but at the same time, he sees the limits of hyper complexity to actually being a good tool to describe a conflict. And I'm going to bring one question from Alan that Alan had earlier that I kept for that moment, because I think it's a really interesting at that specific point. So Alan is asking if we agree with Phil Sabin's opinions on the limitations of computer wargaming. And I think it really connects to this, because he's talking about that aspect and the benefits of manual wargamings in actually making an effort of representation and simplicity to maybe not quantify everything, but come up with novel mechanics that cannot be simply simulated by a computer game. So I don't know if Natalia, you look like you had something that you wanted to say on that specific point.
Yes, actually, I did an experiment on that back in the day to compare the same game that is physical and on computer, and 14 people that play it. And there were 3 rounds where I checked how they would rate this experience. And with the board game, there is a human that explains it. So whatever is happening, you would hear whether you lost the forces or there was a critical mistake, whereas the computer simply shows you good answers and you move forward, or bad answers and you have to come back. And the rating was much higher for the board game. So I was also considering, okay, there are limits to technology depending on your goals. And I would say that in places where you have to explain things, this is where board games, especially facilitated ones, were much stronger. But if you speak about CRTs and other tools where computing is really important, this is where you might find advantage of computer support tools. That being said, they should not replace thinking. So if you have a lot of random data that they are either computer or dice rolls, there is not really a difference in quality, just in method. So this is where we have to look, why is the computer possibly a better tool than the board game?
Sorry, I muted. No, I think it's a really good point. The point that you're making around the player interaction between computer and board game, and that's also something that Phil is talking about. When you're playing a board war game, you're not interacting with the software. Like, the software has to be in your mind, so you have to understand all of the parameters of you interacting with the game, and it has a greater descriptive value for the player. And I think that's definitely one of the things where I fully agree with him, that there is so much benefit in manual wargaming beyond the simplicity of creating one, the fact that it's accessible to everyone, so it's game design is approachable to a wider audience, but also it forces you to really embrace how the game works. What do you think, Riccardo? I saw you nodding earlier.
Yeah. Well, for starters, I remember Jim Danigan, who spoke of the opposition between software, hardware, and mashware, and saying that mashware, that is our brain, is much more powerful because it can make connection, non-mathematical, non-linear connections that cannot be described by algorithms, firstly. Secondly, a computer will always be technically a closed algorithm. I will never know all the operations of a computer board game. I cannot. If I take a computer board war game like Operational Art of War, which is a great computer war game, I have a manual which is 278 pages long, and it has thousands of operations, and I will never be able to do all of these operations. Whereas a simple war game will have similar consequences, manual war game, similar consequences, similar effects, an open algorithm, because I am the engine as a player of the war game. So I have to know all the operations, which are much simpler. I can modify them if I don't like them. So I have a critical approach. I can simplify some rules. I can make them more complex. I can devise new scenarios, and all of these is technically possible in a computer war game, but only to the limits preset by the game author. Otherwise, I have to compile another computer war game, which is beyond possibility. This ties very, very well with the previous question about accuracy and simplicity. They are not an opposition. There is a tension. In the end of the book, it says there is a tension. So this opposition is something that he renounces at the end of the book. And Natalia spoke about constructive complexity. A good friend of mine, Andrea Angiolino, who is the author of Wings of Glory, you all know him, speaks and has written a lot about hidden complexity. So that a game looks simple, but because the components are actually limiting the necessary effort by the players to make the game run. In Wings of Glory, each plane has a preset deck of maneuvers, which are based on the actual features of the plane. And each plane model has its own deck. So we can have rotary engines, which turn better on the right than on the left, and it is made by the deck. No one has to study a rule telling them, with your plane, with your Fokker triplane, you can do 2 turns to the right and only one to the left. So what is complexity anyway? We can have an external, an apparent complexity, which does not necessarily leads us to accuracy, because more external complexity adds margins of errors, more approximations, more distortions made by the author, because an author, when he makes a wargame, inserts his own distortion, his own vision of history, whereas an hidden complexity or a simple game is much more free and can be much more useful, can lead to much better results, even for the reason you stated of cognitive economy and the maintenance of the cognitive focus of the players to the actual situation. They are not stressed out by rules. Natalia told us one good thing: you must not focus on the mechanics. Eurogames do that. Eurogames focus on the mechanics and not the contents. Simulations focus on the content, on what's really happening on the board. This is the most important thing. Rules come after that.
But I think you're making a very good point around what is complexity. I think there is a great episode of Ludology that is talking about this, and they actually have different categories of complexity when it comes to the game. They talk about spatial complexity, arithmetic complexity, strategic complexity in the planning phase and everything. And it's actually, I will probably put the link in the description. I think it's a great podcast. But I think even beyond that, I think there are two levels of complexity, which is the complexity of the system. So the rules, like how complex or is the system that you have to interact with. And then there is the complexity of the game that it creates. And the two are, for me, once again, not correlated. And I think the perfect example of that is the game of Go. I like the game of Go. I've been playing for a long time now, and I'm still really bad at it. But learning the rules took me 5 minutes when I was 12 years old, and 25 years later, I'm still really bad. It's very complex. I cannot figure it out, and that's the whole thing. And I think it's a really good example of that. Like the systemic complexity of Go is very basic. Like it follows very simple rules, but the complexity is almost infinite, to the point that we only lately had AIs that are able to solve the game in a way. But I wanted to push one question to Cory. So there is one question in the chat that I thought was interesting. And I know that you both play war games, manual war games, and a lot of video games. And Jan is actually putting a question here. He's talking about digital games again, and opening the question. So we had this debate around complexity, what games are video games are bringing, but he's thinking, do the digital games in an extended way could bring new things? And he's saying in 5 to 10 years, but actually I'm thinking that already now that there were actually good experiments that the digital tools are actually, when you're looking at them as merging manual board games and video games, and I'm thinking everything that we do in Tabletop Simulator, what you can do in VR today, actually you could actually bridge that gap and had I don't know, you could say an augmented board game experience. So I wanted to, just for you to react to that specific question.
Yeah, so with the tools that we have today, we're able to start leveraging things like augmented reality. We're not that far away from being able to use our phones to actually pull up information off of the board that they're looking at, right? So there could be layers of digital board game on top of physical board game. And there are games out there that have done that. They haven't taken off yet, but it's coming at some point. Beyond that, when it comes to the divide between digital and tabletop games, it's shrinking in a lot of other ways. Tabletop Sim and Vassal let you do, manual war games on the computer, and they also let you prototype things that you want to physically make. Beyond even that, I kind of want to jump back to the complexity of computer games. When you're doing that like bottom systems up approach, where you have like every single person that was involved in the conflict is modeled, and getting information out of that, I don't think that's where computer games will shine and simulations shine. They shine where you are doing more than you can do with a board game, right? You have your battle element, you have your political element, you have your logistics, you have production capacities, you have like complex diplomacy, more than what you could have in a board game that has rules, right? Something more akin to like an RPG, a role-playing game. I think that's all I wanted to say.
That was an unexpected finish to your. That was great, but I think it's a really good point. But I guess that we're 40 minutes in already. It's going extremely fast, and I'm realized. So I was warning that we had a series of topics that I wanted us to address in 1 hour, 1 hour and a half. We did only 2 out of those 6. Or 3, something like this. So we're not going to be on schedule, but I think that we can potentially move on. And there was so the other topic that I wanted to discuss about this specific book, and I think is very central to Philip Sabin's reflection, and that's the whole discussion around what does victory mean. The whole reflection that he has around the likelihood of outcomes, and how war games can actually be a tool for analyzing history. And when I read that section, it really struck me because I think it was a year and a half ago, I had a discussion with an old war game designer called Jack Rady. I don't know for those of you who know him. So he was the head of People's War Games, and he did a lot of war games on the Eastern Front, and he was. He had a very specific perspective when it comes to thinking about the Eastern Front, because he was a communist and he had this very radical view for the time that actually was proven right later, that the Red Army wasn't as bad as it was described in American history academia. And he actually worked a lot on the archives, on really doing his own research, because he was an historian, and he actually used this as a way for him to approach history. And he had this anecdote of, when he was playing a game, he saw that in the archives they were saying that I think it was a major offensive that happened in 44, something like this. I need to look back. And Stalin committed to Eisenhower to do an offensive a month earlier than expected, just so they could put a bit of pressure, while on the West Front they could do something. And basically, I think it was Zhukov that was saying at the time, "Oh, we had to advance this. The operation didn't go as well as planned because we had to advance it for political reason." Once again, going back to, it's not only about simulating conflict, you also have to simulate like stuff around. I think that was interesting, but yeah. Anyway, that's but basically he was saying, like, he was looking at what the generals at the time were saying, and he was doing a game on the topic, and he said, well, what would have happened if they were better equipped, had everything planned for, and they started the operation 1 month later? What would have been the effect using his own system? And actually what he saw was, yes, they would have taken less casualty, but actually the operation wouldn't have been a success, because starting 4 weeks later, they would have had the mud coming earlier, and they couldn't have done the whole push that they actually planned for. So at the time, they had the feeling like them being forced to do it earlier was probably caused a lot of failure, even if caused a lot of casualty, even if the operation was a success. So they had this impression, but actually through wargaming, he actually applied his theory that he actually proved the point that actually it was probably a good idea to start earlier anyway, because if not, they would have failed. And I wanted to have, and I think Phil is making a really great point around all this. So he has this graphic around the likelihood of outcome that I think is really interesting that you have here, where he's really thinking about, okay, what is happening, what I'm trying to expose here, and rethinking about war games as a tool to explore what his history, what makes sense and everything. And I wanted to think about how do you feel about this? And maybe, Natalia, it would be good to start with you, because in a lot of ways, you were probably the one that were the closest to use wargaming to actually predict and simulate something that might happen, and gather actual learnings to take decisions on policies.
Well, I had one specific war game that I designed because I already had suspicions about a given procedure. And I looked at it and I said, oh, that is almost impossible. But just saying that doesn't make any evidence. So we proceeded with around 24 games over 2 years, where we saw if you precisely use this procedure, what happens. And 95% of the time it was a failure. So you are giving a procedure to the unit which you know will not be successful. And that puts them at real risk. And not only that, you also have to admit that in most of the scenarios, they are not able to apply it, even though that is now the existing procedure. So obviously I came in to the office of the commander and I said, these are the results, and My feeling was we have to do something about it, but as you might know, big organizations are not keen on changing this paper dragons. So we have been fighting it, you could say, as a rebellion, where I would insist on showing this war game to every unit that would use it. So they already knew it, that, hey, in the debriefing we say, yes, there is a scenario where this could work, but all of the other ones, be aware that this is what happens. And it is not your unit that is failing, it's the procedure that is badly written. And it worked, so everybody was in agreement on that issue, even though it has not on paper changed. But this way, Wargame can show what are the consequences of a given approach.
David, I saw you nodding. I saw you nodding a lot. I think you, and you have a bit of a hybrid maybe perspective on this because you're also a researcher in the Army. So it's in the U.S. Navy, right? And I'm not. I don't remember. I'm not sure. I'm saying no. Oh, you're muted, David.
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, that's kind of I work for the Department of Defense as an intelligence analyst, right? So that's my day job, and so. Yeah, I mean, I think what's one thing that Sabin says, and it's super important, is what's the educational objective of the game, right, or the simulation. And I think that's just so important to keep in mind because one thing he talks about is the general lessons learned that you can people experience when they're playing war games that's different than reading, right? So I can say like, you know, you're on the advantage by typically it's advantageous to be on the defense, right? And I can say that, and a person can read it and they can say, okay, I guess that's true. I don't really necessarily understand why that is, but I've heard that all the time, so I guess that's true. But then you play a war game, and about 5 seconds into it, you're like, okay, now I get it. Now I understand why I want to be on the defensive and why. Okay, tell me supply, right? Understanding supply and the impacts of supply become extremely obvious when you play a war game, when otherwise those kinds of concepts in war, people just don't even think about, right? And so I think probably more powerful than anything else is what is the thing I'm trying to do with my game? What's the objective? And then being able to have the game evoke or whatever, exemplify that, right? And so I think Sabin really hits the mark here. I think this is one of the strongest areas of the book for me.
And actually, in a way, he also makes a good point around. He actually saves a bit his argument around accuracy and complexity because he actually, I think he has a whole paragraph around different games on the Battle of Stalingrad. And how specific games make a better representation of that specific battle because they include a certain level of detail in the orders of battle and the positioning that actually makes the understanding of the battle more accurate. And I think he's actually saving some of his arguments around complexity in that section where I think he's actually making a solid and an interesting argument on this. And I think your point about saying being on the defense is better and you don't really know what it means, and it's often that. I think I had a bit the same experience when it comes to the war of Korean War. Like I've read a bit about it, and I was like, oh, there is an amphibious attack in Incheon, and then everyone reverts back, like the North Korean go back, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And you don't really understand why. And even if you play a really simple game about the Korean War, I think Hold Fast Korea, when you start playing the game and you see an amphibious attack from the United Nations in Incheon actually cutting all of your supply lines when you're the North Korean, you understand really fast where you're retreating as fast as you can. I think it's a really good point about, there are some things that become very compelling.
It works in Scotland too. I tried a similar maneuver in Emerald, the Scots, and the Scots all fled up to their lands. So it works even if you do it in Edinburgh or not just on Incheon.
Yeah, I think it should work everywhere. But I think it goes to explain, I think the point that David was making around supply lines, and also that Natalia was making around applying like a directive into a game, it illustrates point really, really well. And I don't know what you think about this, Riccardo.
I think, this is totally one of the strongest points in the book, because once again, Sabin tells us with that Stalingrad example, he really applies a mention that he makes, I think, a bit before in the book, a mention of Haggard, the difference between quantitative complexity and qualitative complexity, which are two very, very, very different concepts. Also, another thing, Sabin once again tells us wargames are about dynamics. If I study what victory means at Waterloo, I'm studying Waterloo, but I'm studying actually what really victory means. And this is important because when you go outside the conventional war games, military war games, exclusively military war games, and you go to the political military war games, you also have the author's vision. For example, think about Twilight Struggle, the victory condition, the DEFCON victory condition. You win if your opponent unleashes nuclear conflict. What kind of victory is that? Really? What kind of it? This is a message. This is a very precise message. Okay, you won, fine. You're winning over thermonuclear radioactive ashes. Yeah, great. This is something that makes you, that really makes you think. And also games about irregular conflicts, as the British discovered in revolutionary America, as the Soviets, well, everybody in Afghanistan discovered, actually a conventional victory on the field might lead to a global defeat in because of other dimensions. And good war games, which really incorporate all of these factors, really show you that, and show you one last thing, that there is not just one victory. Victory and defeat, reality is not digital, it's analogic. There is not one state of, okay, I won, or one state of, okay, I lost. There are many different victories. There are many different defeats. Germany surely will be defeated in World War II. But think about Battle for Germany. There are at least 3 or 4 different kinds of defeat for the German player in Battle for Germany. Because especially when there are the 4-player variant, there can be a part of Germany that survives as an independent nation. Germany totally overwhelmed as it was in reality. Or even the Soviets and the Americans in the Western Allies do not obtain a final total victory. So this is what really war game tell us, that there is not just one victory, there is not just one defeat, and that each victory or defeat is just the setup scenario for the next game, which is really another interesting topic. Yeah, it's about Castle, the space race. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a very good comment. I fully agree. Yes, this is a perfect conclusion. Yeah. No, but I think it's a really interesting point, and I was trying to find through the book, but I couldn't find it. But around the different kinds of victories, I think there is a moment where Phil actually has a matrix with different outcomes for both factions, and you actually have different kind of. And I think that's a really interesting idea of what does victory mean. Also, it's like, because it might be very different. And I think Waterloo is a perfect example of that. And sorry for ranting over Waterloo over and over and over again, but I think the problem with Waterloo is that, what does a French victory mean? Even if they won on the field, like, even if Grouchy comes back and Blücher is late, like, perfect scenario, like, yeah, like Napoleon wins at Waterloo, so what? Like, the empire is dead. Like,
after that there are 500,000 Austro-Russians coming from.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe the Belgian campaign ends. Yeah, okay, it goes to Brussels, awesome, but then it's over. Like,
probably it will be a different kind of defeat for France.
Yeah,
France will be defeated, but probably it will be a different defeat. Maybe Napoleon stays on the throne, or maybe he can give the throne to his son. We don't know. There are many different outcomes,
and I think it also makes a point for a war game is beyond pure conflict simulation. And I'm looking at you, Cory, because I think it's like we've been talking about a lot of those games and what does victory mean, and a lot of the points that Riccardo are making are both military and political. And we know each other from the Coin Discord server. We play a lot of Coin games, and Coin games are known for actually all those layers together, where you have a bit of a geopolitical aspect, you have a bit of a pure political aspect, dynamics between factions that are negotiating with each other, and then it translates loosely and very abstractly on the board, where the actual tactics is not really that important. In a lot of ways, it does portray the complexity of conflict in a way more efficient manner. So I was thinking, what were your thoughts around all this?
So my thoughts here are, right, when you're dealing with a consim, you're dealing with a mental Rubik's Cube of the conflict, right? It's a physical model that lets you manipulate everything that's going on. You get to manipulate the inputs, you manipulate the outputs by what the actions that you're taking, whatnot. I think a lot of times when you're setting up your victory conditions for the side that loses, I'm going to use Fire in the Lake as an example, coin game about Vietnam. What's an Arvin victory actually mean? Like, Arvin victory on the map still looks like an NVA victory. All it means really is that, yeah, maybe the cities are under Arvin control and they managed to take a lot of money and run. And that's a victory, right? The people in charge got out. That's kind of the victory. That's who you're playing when you're playing the Arvin. I think it's really useful to look at what a limited scope of victory means for the historically losing side. What that actually means. It's not really a victory most of the time, but it might mean the people in charge of that side get to, keep their heads or keep their money or live a successful life. People power. What's a victory for the government look like? Running away with money, I think, not really staying in charge.
I think you're making an interesting point, Cory. Like, should we think about the intimate implication of those actors? Was Ho Chi Minh happy after the win? What was his love life like? And actually, just found a book about. I just took a picture for the chat on Red Flag Over Paris. A book about the intimate life of Bismarck, which I was like, I never thought about this, but what was his intimate life like? What life he had after basically destroying France? Like, I was really thinking, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, we should think about this. And Giuseppe is saying something really interesting about this all comes down to the scale, and I think I agree. Of course, a tactical victory, you can represent it in Waterloo, potentially an operational one, but then there is maybe not much at stake when it comes to the strategy. But I think they are hard to fully distinguish, and I think that makes a good transition to the next point that I wanted to address. And we're starting to go finally into the part 2 of the book, which is about the mechanics. And I think maybe I'll regroup most of the discussion into the mechanics, because I think when he's talking about the mechanics, Phil Sabin is actually giving an overview of what's the Wargame Designer Toolbox. And the thing that surprised me when I read this is that I see a lot of hexes, a lot of zones of control, a lot of CRTs. And my first question to you, and I'm looking at you, David, at you specifically, looking deep into your eyes, do you think that toolbox is a bit outdated?
No. Right. So I actually wrote no exclamation point, ellipses, but, right? So, I mean, no, it's clearly, is it outdated? No. It has uses, right? It does things well, I think. Right, and we're talking about the combination of these things, right? So what people would often think is traditional components of a hex and counter game. It does do some things well. I think that many of the things it seeks to do can be done in better ways with different mechanisms, right? So I'm not saying that you should not play a hex and counter game, right? And we talked about probably my best-selling game is Undaunted Normandy. Those are hexes, right?
So they might look like game.
Yeah, it's a hex and counter game, right? And so they might look like offset squares, and they might not be the counters people are familiar with, but that's what it is. And there's a reason for that, and there's a lot of goodness that comes from it. But I don't think it's necessarily a good practice to get into to say, hey, I want to design a war game and start from the sort of, it must be a hex and counter game, so now where will I go with that, right?
Yeah, and I think it's a good point, because I wanted to be a bit provocative with that question, because actually I was a bit surprised it was limited to this, and I'm going to explain why. just to be clear, I play hex encounters. It's probably after discovering Twilight Struggle, it's one of the type of game that I played the most. That's how I got into wargaming, and I think I personally really think that hex encounters can be modernized, and they still have a lot to offer. I think can be a great system, and I think actually one of Phil Sabin's game, Hell's Gate, is modernizing hex encounters in a lot of ways. Not modernizing, but taking a very different and interesting approach to it. So that's not what I'm saying. But he wrote the book in 2012, and I looked at 2012, the decade before 2012. What were the top war games that were released between 2002 and 2012? And the thing is, when you look at the top board games that were released at that time, what you see is 2004, Memoir 44, 2005, Twilight Struggle, Here I Stand and Combat Commander in 2006, Labyrinth in 2010, and then in 2011 you have Sekigahara and A Few Acres of Snow. And I'm like, my God, like, and going back to your point, Riccardo, about, it was written 2012. I mean, come on, like the toolbox was pretty expanded at that point, and there was like some massive massive games that actually were changing for almost a decade already before that. And I mean, Path of Glory was 1999.
But
I mean,
once again, Fred, it was not yet a trend. These were single war games. They were very important.
You cannot say that. You cannot say that.
It was not still totally recognized as
Path
a constant
of Glory,
trend.
Washington's War, Hannibal. Like,
no, it speaks about card-driven war games.
Successors, yeah, but I mean, like when you think about the toolbox,
it speaks about card-driven going. Sabin, for this, I have to say that we must contextualize it. Okay, we must see it in the context. What Sabin is answering to the other X and counter players, the monster game players. He is not speaking to the general player, to the general wargamer. He is speaking about people who is not interested in Combat Commander versus ASL. This is not the topic of his book. The topic of his book is that a simple SPI game can still be considered a good, accurate war game. In a year where, in a moment, in a precise period of wargaming history, when the players of monster war games were saying that even Napoleon's Last Battles, after all, was not such a great war game because it was too simple. We must never forget that SPI titles, which are the classics, which we consider classic, for many wargames, especially in 2012, when there was not yet this trend of hybridation, where A Few Acres of Snow was a single of its kind. It was just Martin Wallace doing these kinds of games. Just like that, people were saying that Napoleon's Last Battles was not such a war game because it was a light war game, because it was an introductory war game. SPI titles are today what we call light introductory war games. It's true, Sabin cannot compare Napoleon's Last Battles to W1815 or something like that. These are totally different toolboxes. Probably he will find ways to say that even them are good, accurate war games, and probably he will say that now that this trend has solidified and that the debate in the wargaming community has gone forward. But in 2012, it was not at this present stage. I know this is strange, but Sabin is writing an academic book for his students and for wargamers, not for the general public. Today, we are used to speak to a much broader public, a much broader wargaming community than in 2012. 2012, yeah, there was YouTube, but there were not so many wargaming YouTubers. It was a total rarity. It was a totally different world. That toolbox, that old SPI toolbox, today may look a bit limited, but it is just like we see Newtonian physics after the theory of relativity. Newtonian physics is still valid. David is right. In certain domains, that toolbox is exactly what we need. Exactly like to describe some phenomena, some natural phenomena, we have to use Newtonian physics. We know that there is relativity and that there is also quantum theory, and they're all operating, but we are not interested in that. To describe an historical event through a certain point of view, the classic toolbox is perfect. The only problem, and this is what Sabin is saying, do not make it overly complex, because then it will not work. It will lose its greatest asset, cognitive simplicity, immediate understanding, immediate vision of the situation. These are the main objectives of Sabin, because Sabin is a teacher. He wants to teach. He wants that the situation is clear and accurate and reasonably accurate.
I think I disagree with some of your points, but it's not going to be another Fred and Riccardo debate. I will keep that for another time. Actually, I would like to ask for the opinion of the only professional in that panel. When you look at that toolbox, Natalia, what do you think based on your own experience?
If I may, I have to also disagree with the first part, because I see all as professionals, and you are very serious about war games. So I definitely count this as one team. And I would certainly say we did always expand the number of mechanics that we are using. So every situation gives a new mechanic that can be used. And as Riccardo said, you have some basics that they are good to know them, because maybe that's the easiest way to represent a given combat, war, or system. And then that is also true that you have to look at target audience of different war games. So when I started designing war games, I also looked at my sample, and I have to say around 80% completely didn't know war games. They didn't play one in their life, even though they mostly came from military. So they were they had very low tolerance towards these big systems and new things they have to start to control. And then you had 15% that came from nations that use wargaming in training, and they were more up for the challenge because they thought, okay, new system, I'm happy to learn it. And 5% are us, people that enjoy wargame for weeks, that you go turn-based and you save it and you have separate table where it lies forever. But that is really 5% of general population for me. So then we have to think, okay, how do you bridge that gaps depending on the target audience? That's why I think it's really good to experiment with new mechanics, and specifically with those that can, as you say, make hybrids between different species.
Yeah, and I think you're making a really good point, Natalia, because I think that the toolbox that you're using, if you limit it to a specific subsets of mechanics that are clearly established, you actually introduce a bias to what you can represent. And I think the hex is a good example of that. Hex is one of the best way to tessellate space. So to separate it in similar spaces. So to simulate movement. It works greatly for open movement. Like if you're thinking maybe about something that is about naval warfare, it makes a lot of sense. It is very efficient in that way. But as soon as you go on a strategic level, does it make sense to have hexagons to represent space? Like, isn't a point-to-point map more relevant? Because a hexagon is not necessarily a good representation of this. And I'm looking at you, Cory, because you started from ASL. You're now a massive coin player. You mostly play coin games, so you actually went the whole way of the spectrum. And I think I would really like to have your point of view on this.
So I think it's really interesting. He brings up in the book, right, zones of control, hexes, CRTs. The games in the book include those, but they also include point-to-point, area control, role-playing with negotiation and asymmetric win conditions. I'm thinking I'm probably missing a couple of things in there. He's using the entire toolbox that we have available to us, and really, if you're dealing with a small area where ground maneuverability is a thing, right? hexes make a lot of sense if you're dealing with like unit fighting on, you know, D-Day. Hexes, definitely, not areas. No. If you're dealing with, you know, control of a country, from like a kind of political, social aspect, areas make a lot more control to me, or point to point even. If you're dealing with old school campaigns through like the American wilderness, point to point, definitely. Like, come on. Every tool has its use, right? There's nothing that's outdated. I don't really like CRTs, but I understand why they exist. You know, I don't have a problem with them. I just, yeah. But yeah, no, I think everything has its place.
And I think I see David has been thinking a lot over over the last few minutes.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've covered it well. I mean, I will say that I think you hit the nail on like the head when, you know, when we talk about things like, and we've heard this a couple of times, nautical movement, air movement. I mean, what else other than something that's really like the clever system in Wings of Glory, right? Which is great. But if you're talking about a board game and not sort of a miniatures game, I mean, I think it's sort of the obvious answer, right? And so go with the tool that works, right? Don't go into it with a limited toolbox would be the only takeaway.
Great, but I think it's a good conclusion to that specific point. We're already 1 hour and 10 minutes in, so I think I'm going to bundle up a few of the topics that I wanted to address for the end. And just as a conclusion, I think that I had a bit of an opening question that I wanted to have, and I think reflecting on the experience part that Phil is sharing at the end, I was thinking, we're talking a lot about wargaming, about how useful it is, what's the toolbox, what does it represent, is it useful to interpret history? But I just wanted to have actually something that goes a bit on the side and looks at it from a different perspective. What do you think the limits are of wargaming? Where do you think it actually doesn't work? Where do you think we should be careful about? And maybe let's start with you, Natalia, your point of view on this.
Interesting question, because I might answer precisely the opposite way. So I have not yet found a limitation I cannot pass with a war game, and I have been challenging this with industrial war games or other topics that don't belong precisely in the format, but you can apply the methods to research it. So the same that you did with history, I did with, I would say, consecutively more strange topics that could fit into this wargaming method. And the question is indeed how much the audience is able to take, and how much are you able to justify using a wargame for a given purpose. And there again, you have to differentiate commercially. It has to be fun. It has to be appealing to a given fan base. And then academically, it has to be, at least from my point of view, true to reality. And if you speak about military, it has to have maximum usefulness. So this is where you have to look at wargaming and push it in that directions. So for that, I have not yet found a limit.
David, what do you think about the limits of wargaming?
You know, it's an interesting question. I will say that you know, I'll try to make this brief. So I used to be a big role-playing gamer, right? That's what I grew up on. I played it until I was maybe joined the Air Force, had kids, and I was always the DM, and I would always make the adventures, right? And it was all like I would ever make everything myself, right? I didn't play anything out of books, and so it was a weird sort of uncontrollable habit, instinct, whatever I had, where anything I was consuming, I was always like subconsciously designing an adventure about, right? I had this thing that I couldn't stop doing. And once I transitioned to playing board games and the designing war games, everything I consume now, like I listen to tons of podcasts, right? About history. And it's like this thing that's constantly happening in my mind where I'm deconstructing whatever it is I'm listening to, and I'm making a war game about it. And I can't stop doing it. It happens all the time. And so I don't know if I have a great answer for you, but I can tell you that every once in a while I'll be listening to a story and I'm like, oh, I can't quite figure out how that would be a war game, and it drives me crazy. It's like this challenge I have, right? So I don't know if there's a great answer in there for you, but it's something that I'm just sort of subconsciously thinking about all the time. It's how would I model this in a war game or a game in general.
So no limits. You actually want to make a war game of everything.
Well,
That's actually
I'm not sure everything. I'm not sure everything, right? but yeah, I mean, it is interesting to see like what could be modeled, and you know, when you're not concerned about commercial viability, and you don't have when you're not working for the military, like you don't have to do it professionally, you know, there's a lot of opportunities there if you're not worried about how big your audience is. So.
Riccardo, on your side, what do you think are the limits of the wargaming experience?
Well, Sabin tells us in one of the most interesting and amazing phrases of his book that wargame design is always about making the best of a bad job. This is totally a bit surprising, but not so much. The problem is wargames are models are interactive, playable models, Danigan, blah, blah, blah. So they are approximations. Approximations have two essential limitations. The first one is objective. There are materials, there is time, you must constrain, you cannot put everything inside a war game because otherwise it will be utterly unplayable, or paradoxically, in the worst case scenario, it will always give you the same consequence because everything will go exactly the same way. It will not be a simulation anymore, it will be a reconstruction. Otherwise, the other limitations are subjective. They are biases. One thing that I've not yet seen, and it is a very interesting field of research, is how to apply behavioral sciences to simulation. Both on the author side, what are the biases of the author? The biases that the author is aware of, and what they are not aware of. Compare all the games about Vietnam that were made in the 70s with the war games about Vietnam that are made today, 70s, 80s, 90s, etc. It is there is a context in which a war game is born, and that imposes some distortions. And then there are the biases of the players, because we all assume that everybody is experiencing the exact same thing when he is playing a war game. This is not true. There are people who are engaged, people who are disengaged, people who are getting one message, people who are getting another message. This message can be right, can be wrong. So war games, yes, in their extension, in the potential extension, they are limitless, they are infinite. But here, yes, in their accuracy and their real value, they have lots of limitations. And it is very hard to overtake this limitation, to solve those problems. And the more advanced a war game is, the more problems, the more issues it encounters, because the model gets bigger and finds new challenges. So there are limitations. We must be aware of those limitations and aware of the fact that there will always be limitations.
So I just want to say, for people who see me interacting with Riccardo quite often, we often argue, but you just have to, just to be clear, there are some moments where we were completely in agreement. And on this one, I'm actually happy that you're bringing this up. I was hoping that you would, because I know that's one of the topics on which we're 100% agree is the bias from the designer and the bias from the players, that are the limits. Also the advantage, as we were saying, the fact that what's powerful about a manual war game is that the game is in your head. And that's the whole thing that makes it interesting, but it means that it lives in your head, and in your head there is a lot of other stuff, and that has an impact on the system itself. But Cory, what do you? Yeah,
I just want to respond real quick to something you and Riccardo are talking about. I think it's an interesting thing. You know, so we talked about a little bit in my day job. I do a lot of analytic modeling, right? So take an intelligence problem, whatever that intelligence problem is, we deconstruct it. And one thing we always do is we have an entire profession called an analytic methodologist, right? Their entire job in life is to lead facilitated sessions about deconstructing problems. And that person is not a subject matter expert, right? So we have subject matter experts come in that know the problem well, and we level the entire discussion with people that are new to it, people that are considered subject matter experts, the analytic methodologist, and the point of all of that is to make sure that biases don't inject, right, how we're going to approach the model, building out the model. And I think one thing that's interesting, and I was able to experience this with 2 games that I've worked on recently, By Stealth and Sea, where Nicola Sagini worked with me, is basically doing the historical research side, and then Michael Kochman on Soldiers and Postmen's Uniforms. Both those relationships were largely the same, where although I was partially engaged with some of the historical research, they led that bit. And it was a nice relationship to have where you have the historic lead and you have a person who's working on the game design. And so you at least remove some of that bias, right? And I think that might be an interesting approach to take in game design, right? Where you have people that are doing the design work independent of some of the historic research, so you don't inject some of the biases into that.
That's very, very interesting. I think we might need to have a separate session just on this and invite one of the consultants, because it's something that I never thought about, and the parallel that you make with your work is I think it's. Yeah. Anyway, we're not going into that. We try to limit it to an hour and a half. Cory, what do you think about the limits of wargaming? Fast.
All right. Hey, this is gonna be super fast. A question for the panel: how many of you are aware of the game Fog of Love?
Oh, yes, yeah.
Is that a war game? Is it a conflict sim? Yeah, 100%.
100%.
I don't think there's any hard limits on what a war game can be and what a conflict sim can be. There are specific things that they're not going to be good at demonstrating, right? Because of complexity, because of scope, things like that. But there's not like, oh, you can never touch this subject. No, you can't touch the whole subject maybe, but you can touch, this thing in it. Anything is open, I think.
I think that it's a really great point. Thank you, Cory. You're saying in 30 seconds something way more intelligent than I could say in 5 minutes. So that's really awesome. So that was a discussion around Simulating War by Philip Sabin. Maybe as a conclusion, I would like to ask each member of the panel, would you recommend the book to the audience if some haven't read it? Personally, I would 100% recommend. It was thought-provoking. I thought it was really great. I think there is a lot of great elements in it. I think Phil is brilliant, and there is a lot of really cool examples. But what do you think, Cory?
100% recommend. Also, he lays out a DIY punk ethos for creating what you need, and that's something we need more of.
Yeah, definitely. Print and play is the way to go, definitely. Riccardo, would you recommend?
Absolutely. You just have to take the same critical approach that Sabin promotes even to his own book. So you have to think while you read. You must not accept it as the Bible. It is not the Bible.
No.
You must. It must be critical about it. You must challenge Sabin. You must find its limits and go beyond those limits. And I'm sure, I do not know him personally, but I read his interviews, and then he went beyond this book. He is very open-minded, and he's very, very, very open also to criticism. This is the sign of a great author. So yes, totally, absolutely recommended, even for the punk attitude, do it yourself. Yeah, that's what we really need in war games.
And I would say, Riccardo, I would also be critical of the Bible, It's like, so even if it was the Bible, we should deconstruct it and think about who wrote it and why.
I am not a
we
Catholic,
disagree on that, but that's another discussion. David, so would you recommend?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Riccardo said everything I would say way better. So yeah, 100% recommend. Even the parts I disagreed with, I thought were very interesting and thought-provoking. So yeah, totally recommend.
And Natalia?
Same here. It's good to read, good to compare, good to get inspired.
Great. But then, as I promised to Kilroy was here, that was asking earlier in the chat. So that concludes the Wargame Book Club #1, where we're discussing about Phil Sabin Simulating War. And I asked each member of the panel to actually suggest a book for vote. So each of you will pick a book. Then the audience will vote in the next couple of weeks for us to decide which book we're going to discuss for Wargame Bookclub number 2. And I guess we can start with you, Natalia. What's your pick?
I recently read The Craft of Wargaming, and it is a bit updated look from this year. It's quite a story about American wargaming, and I would recommend it as an updated version of Sabin's book and more related to military topics.
Great. David?
So I would say that the next book that's on my desk to read is called Blood for Dignity. It's about the first integrated platoons in the U.S. Army, right? And so one thing that came out of, if you guys will indulge me for just a minute, one thing that came out of Undaunted, on the cover, it features African-American soldiers. And I've had a ton of people reach out to me about how that's horrible because it's ahistorical. And all of these people say that, what they'll say is that's ahistorical. There were no African Americans integrated in World War II with American units, and that's just not true, right? They'll say there were segregated units, and if they were arguing that the 30th Infantry Division, which is what the game is about, that's true. They were never integrated, or they were never integrated. They weren't integrated at Normandy. That is a truth statement, but that's not what the argument is, right? And so the argument is flawed. And so I'm reading about this book, and I said earlier that you can usually tell what game I'm designing by what book is on my desk. So I'll just leave it at that. But Blood for Dignity is what's on my desk now. And
great. That's a great pitch, Riccardo.
Yeah, this is really an interesting title, because I have to confess that I was not really aware of the story of the integration in World War II in the U.S. Army, and it is totally a really interesting and important topic. For me, my proposal is a classic, Johann Huizinga, Homo Ludens, which is a book that describes how culture is, not how game is born out of culture, but how culture is born out of games. And it is a basic, fundamental book, because you understand what a game is, and you understand why simulation games are actually very, very close to the original meaning of games for men. It is a book about men, about history, about the human experience, men and women, human beings, and their cognitive processes. Totally fundamental book.
I wouldn't say it's a basic book. I would say maybe fundamental.
Basic. It's an Italianism. It's the base upon which you build everything up.
Yeah.
It's not basic. It's short. It's short and simple apparently, but it very thought promoting. It is fundamental.
And Cory, what do you have a suggestion or proposal?
Yeah, I think Natalia's book, Wargaming Experiences, would be an excellent choice for this book club.
And he's absolutely not biased, of course.
Oh, never.
Thank you, Cory.
You're welcome.
And my proposal for vote is When Titans Clashed. It's Morgane Gouillon-Réty who told me that I should read it, so definitely I got it, and I'm trying to use the book club as a way for me to force myself to read some books that is on my shelf of shame of reading, and this is about how the Red Army was organized. And it first looks into the first border war conflicts, early World War II against the Japanese on the east side of Russia, and then it looks into how the Red Army organization evolved during the whole conflict after Barbarossa and how they pushed back, and goes into the analysis of a lot of their strategies. And there is a thing that I love about this book, especially in that extended version, is that at the end there is just a huge amount of tables after tables of statistics, and it makes me very happy. I love tables, so that's really great, and it looks like just an awesome book, awesome maps, very interesting, very thought-provoking. So that's my fifth proposal. So I would make a questionnaire on the page, and everyone will be able to vote, and in a week we will decide which one we pick for the book club number 2. And I think that concludes it for now. So just a few things for everyone to know. So next week, there won't be any live stream because next week is the San Diego Historical Con. And I think a lot of us is probably going to be there. We're going to have a lot of work, a lot of presentation. I'm going to be helping Joe Dewhurst on a couple of his presentations for the Pure Land. Myself, I would be doing a few presentations on Red Flag over Paris and a Jest of Robin Hood, so I would have a bit of work on my side. So no live stream next weekend. Maybe in the meantime, at some point, I might play a game of No Retreat with Jason Carr, but that would be a complete surprise. No one we probably won't plan for it, but yes for it, and maybe we'll have time. Who knows? And the next session is going to be normally Saturday the 29th, and we're going to talk about wargame art. And I'm inviting 3 very talented graphics designers that I admire a lot, Ivan Caceres, Don Egarty, and Niels Johansson, to talk about. Oh yeah, David is super excited. Yes, yeah. I'm a fan. I'm a really fan of those 3. So it's gonna be very very fun. So yeah, and I think expanding a bit the topics and talking about art in Wargame is also something that we don't do enough, and I think that would be fun. I wanted to thank the 4 of you massively for joining for this. It was an experiment. I didn't know what to expect. You didn't know what to expect. I really appreciate the fact that you just jumped in and say, yeah, of course, why not? Let's try. It's going to be fun. I think your inputs were awesome. It was way better than what I could have expected. It was really, really cool. So thanks a lot for that. And I don't know, I would probably invite some of you for other occasions. If you want to be part of a panel in the future, I would be more than happy to invite you guys again. It was really awesome. Thank you for tonight, and we'll end the broadcast here. And good evening to everyone, and thanks again for all the interactions. And yes, one last thing, Giuseppe is saying on the 29th, there is also the Federation of Italian Wargaming Convention. I will also be there, but it's not overlapping with the live stream, so that's fine. Yes, Giuseppe, I will be here. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.